Konnichiwa. Welcome to Chocolate with Ed Garcia. I'm Ed Garcia, and this is chocolate, lovely chocolate. Today we have Meiji hazelnut. I like nut covered with chocolate. This one is hazelnut with slightly dark chocolate. Oh, so delicious, so delicious. How do I open it? All right, well, let's just unbox it. All right, we don't need that part. So this is Japanese packaging, package within a package. Here we go. Oh, it smells wonderful. It smells like hazelnut. Oishii. Itadakimasu. Delicious. Okay, this is speech 25, interview rules. Now, these rules are based on 6 of my previous speeches. At the end of this speech, at the end of speech 25, I will give a list of links to my speeches on YouTube, and I will put in bold the ones that are related to these interview rules. They are really scattered throughout many of the speeches. Okay, interview rules. As you know, I'm a U.S. patent attorney. I used to be a U.S. patent examiner, and I have my email here, and I have a YouTube channel called Chocolate with Ed Garcia, where I give educational speeches about United States patent law intended for Japanese engineers and Japanese attorneys. So here we go. Here are the contents. There are going to be 7 interview rules, and 2 of them are about the right time. The right time: no early interviews. No interviews before the second office action. Also, the right time is late interviews. Interviews after the second office action might be good. The right reason. 2 things about the right reason. No new features. Do not have an interview to discuss features that are new, features that have not yet been examined by the patent examiner, because the patent examiner will not search those features for an interview. Let me say it again. The patent examiner will not search those features for an interview. The patent examiner will not search those features for an interview. So why are you going to have an interview with the patent examiner to discuss features that he has not searched? Has no value, okay? Has no value. 90% of the interviews that I see are for this reason. Don't do it. Don't do it. Continuing. The right reason. A strong written argument has failed. Then you want to talk to the examiner. The right people. 2 things about the right people. You want an examiner with negotiation authority. That's a primary examiner or a supervisor. Okay? Now, the right people. Sometimes you want the supervisor. You want the power. So there are times when you specifically request a supervisor, even if you already have a primary examiner. The right procedure. 2 things about the right procedure. Notice of allowance or office action. The purpose of the interview is to receive a notice of allowance now. Now. Okay? Or a new office action. Now, again, the right procedure, examiner's amendment. Examiner's amendments are very powerful. You need to understand when they may be used, and ideally tell the attorney that's performing the interview, I give you authority to give the examiner authority to make certain examiner's amendments, and we'll discuss this. So here we go. Here are the 7 rules. If you follow these 7 rules, you will greatly reduce the number of interviews that you have, and the interviews that you have will be much more effective. I've been in Japan for 4 years now. The interviews are a disaster. They're a disaster. The large majority of them should not occur, okay? And then when they occur, they're occurring with the wrong people, and the right procedures are not being followed. You'll see what I mean. Now, here are the rules. Number 1, do not have any interview before the second office action. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't have an interview before the second office action. Don't do it. 2, do not have any interview to discuss adding new features. Why? Why would you have an interview to discuss adding a new feature? The examiner has not searched the new feature, a new feature being a feature that is not in any of the claims previously examined. Now, number 3, please have an interview after a strong and complete written argument has failed. For example, there's a first office action, you write a first response. You receive the second office action and it says, Mr. Attorney and Mr. Applicant, your arguments are non-persuasive. We are not allowing anything. Well, at that point, you have a clear written record. The examiner has provided written rejections in the first office action. You've provided written arguments and perhaps amendments in your first response. And now the examiner is saying, no. At this point, the writing has failed. The written procedures have failed. Now may be a good time to have an interview. Okay? 4, interviews should always include a primary examiner or a supervisor, SPE, with negotiation authority. Continuing. Consider requesting that a supervisor, SPE, supervisory patent examiner, attend the interview, especially before filing a notice of appeal. Now, when you've dealt with the examiner, let's say twice, and failed twice, then you have to consider bringing in the supervisor. Here's the point. Notice of appeal, if you pay the money for notice of appeal and file a pre-appeal brief, at that point, the supervisor will look at your case and consider what's going on. What I say is you don't want to pay for the notice of appeal and the pre-appeal brief. Just ask for the supervisor. We want the supervisor now. We want the notice of allowance now. We don't want to file a notice of appeal. We don't want to file a pre-appeal brief. We don't want to wait for decisions. No, we want it now. Notice of allowance now. Okay? 6, if all pending rejections are overcome by previously submitted claims, then the patent office should promptly mail a notice of allowance or an office action. Okay, the last one, number 7. This is related. What do we want? We want notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. Request an examiner's amendment to get an immediate notice of allowance. For example, if you propose in writing in the agenda some amendments, for example, clarifications that do not require a new search, perhaps clarifications that overcome a indefiniteness rejection. And the examiner says, good, that overcomes the indefinite rejection. Please file that in a response and I will allow it. And you should say, the patent attorney should say, well, what do you want? Notice of allowance. When do you want it? Now. You don't want to file a response. Examiner's amendment. You should say, Mr. Primary Examiner, I hereby authorize you to make by examiner's amendment the amendments in the agenda and give me the notice of allowance. all right? The claims are there. The proposed amendments are there. And I, as the attorney, have authority to make these proposed amendments, right? The client already reviewed the proposed amendments. The client agreed, let's try to get these proposed amendments allowed. And if the primary examiner says they are allowable, then the attorney should say, excellent, notice of allowance now. After you, Mr. Primary Examiner, please do a examiner's amendment. The examiner can do substantive amendments to the claims, with authority from the attorney, okay? He needs authority. So here it is, examiner's amendment. Now these are 7 rules that will, number 1, greatly reduce the number of interviews that you have. And number 2, greatly increase the productivity of those interviews, including techniques to get notice of allowance now without filing a response. Okay? Here we go. Now, all of these have been discussed in my previous speeches, so I'm going to do them very briefly. The right time, no early interviews. Do not have any interviews before the second office action. Attempt to solve early problems by a written response to the first office action. Now, exceptions. There's always exceptions, right? Procedural or legal issues may need to be resolved before a written response. Now, let's talk about statistics that I've mentioned before. One large study with 17,000 applications had 18% interviews, okay? So out of every 5 cases, there was 1 interview. Let me say that again. Out of every 5 cases, there was 1 interview. And early interviews before second office action had, quote, this is quote, no effect on the grant rate, okay? No effect on the allowance rate. Let me say that again. Interviews, a study of 17,000 applications found that early interviews, that's interviews before the second office action, had no effect on the allowance rate, the grant rate. Additionally, I did a study of 50 published applications and the public prosecution history of one mid-sized Japanese firm, and I found exactly the same thing, okay? Early interviews had no effect. Continuing. What about late interviews? Interviews after the second office action. The Crouch study found that applications with late interviews after at least a second office action had a relatively high grant rate of 74% compared with only 60% for applications with a second office action without an interview, okay? So Crouch found that for late interviews, the allowance rate was 74% compared to 60% if there was no interview. Now, my study of a mid-sized Japanese firm found no effect from late interviews. Now, the mid-sized Japanese company was having 80% of the applications had interviews. 80%. Crouch was finding 20%. Okay, so any good effect from late interviews, I think, was hidden by the large amounts of bad interviews. Continuing. The right reason, no new features. So, rule number 2, do not have any interview to discuss adding new features. What's the exception? The exception is in very complex cases, perhaps 10% of the cases for the mid-sized Japanese firm that I mentioned. You may have an interview to technically educate the examiner. If there are so many problems that you think you cannot solve them with a written response and you want 20 minutes of back and forth with the examiner, then this is the exception, okay? But I would say 10% of the cases, not 80%, right? This is exceptions are exceptions, okay? There should be few. The right reason: strong written argument has failed. Please have an interview after a strong and complete written argument has failed. Okay? And we already discussed this. Now, for the right people, let's talk about the right people. Who do you want in the interview? You want an examiner with negotiation authority, okay? The rule number 4, interviews should always, that's very strong, that's in the MPEP, the Manual of Patent Examination Procedures, should always include a primary examiner or a supervisory patent examiner. Now, exception: negotiation authority is not required for formalities such as correction of improper drawings. MPP 713.05 states that an interview should always include an examiner with negotiation authority. Why? They tell you why. So that authoritative agreement may be reached at the time of the interview. Okay? The Patent Office also wants authoritative agreement. They want someone with authority to grant a notice of allowance, meaning a primary examiner or a supervisory examiner, to be able to agree with the applicant on what has to be done to put the claims in condition for allowance, preferably right now, based on an examiner's amendment, or right now based on previously submitted claims, okay? What do we want? Allowance. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Allowance. When do we want it? Now. Continuing. The right people, supervisors. Consider requesting that the supervisor attend the interview. There are some circumstances in which the interview should include the supervisor, for example, before filing a notice of appeal and a pre-appeal brief. Anytime you reach a wall, you fail twice with the examiner, and you think, I really need to appeal. I need to get around this examiner. I need to reach the supervisor. You reach the supervisor more cheaply and more quickly by an interview. Number 8, right procedure again. Notice of allowance or office action. What do we want? Notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. So, rule number 6, if all pending rejections are overcome by previously submitted claims, okay, I gave you the fact pattern where previously submitted claims were rejected by the second office action, and then we have an interview. And then in this case, if the primary examiner says, oh, good argument, I didn't understand, it looks allowable. In this case, the patent office should, notice I say should, promptly mail a notice of allowance or an office action, okay? If they make a new updated search, if the primary examiner wants to make an updated search, okay, go ahead. But I, the applicant, should not have to file a response, a duplicate response with no new information. I should not have to do it. Now, here's the dangerous part. I should not have to do it, but my clock is ticking. Okay, my 6-month deadline to file a response is going tick, 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 tick. So I have to convince the primary examiner to please agree that you're going to do this within 1 week, and to put this information that you're going to give me notice of allowance or an office action without my filing a response, and you're going to do it within a specific period of time, 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever, preferably today, but 1 week, and put that in the interview summary, okay? If the primary examiner says no, what do you do? Well, first, what do you want? Notice of allowance. When do you want it? Now. If the primary examiner refuses to take action and requires you, the applicant, to file a response, what do? You ask the primary examiner to discuss this with his supervisor and then to tell you the results. This is the best way to do it, because the supervisor will tell him, do the updated search and mail the notice of allowance or a new office action. Don't make the applicant do useless work. One more thing. Again, you still have the 6-month deadline going tick, 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 tick. You don't want to miss the 6-month deadline and then have to file a petition. Okay. The right procedure, examiner's amendment. Rule 7, request an examiner's amendment to get an immediate notice of allowance, okay? If you're close, so close you can taste it, they're saying yes, 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 and you're saying yes, 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 you're in agreement, the only thing that needs to be done is a amendment submitted. Well, you can do it verbally. If it's a, for example, an informality, antecedent basis error, A should be the, or the should be A, or something small, the second wheel should be the third wheel. Examiner's amendment. What do we want? Notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. By examiner's amendment. Okay? Now, the applicant may consider this during instructions for the interview. The applicant may say, here are the proposed amendments. If the examiner agrees that these are allowable, please ask the examiner to perform an examiner's amendment. Okay? So we don't have to file a response. Put it in writing. That's the best thing. So, what are the 7 rules? Here's a summary of the 7 rules. I'm going to just read them so you remember them with no comment. Rule number 1, do not have any interview before the second office action. Rule number 2, do not have any interview to discuss adding new features. Rule number 3, please have an interview after a strong and complete written argument has failed. Number 4, interviews should always include a primary examiner or a supervisor. Rule number 5, consider requesting a supervisor attend the interview, especially before filing a notice of appeal. Number 6, if all pending rejections are overcome by previously submitted claims, then the patent office should promptly mail a notice of allowance or an office action, and the U.S. attorney must push for this. Request it, insist upon it, yell, call the supervisor if necessary. Number 7, request an examiner's amendment to get an immediate notice of allowance. What do we want? Notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. Now. Okay? This is the attitude you want your attorney to have. Okay, so here's a list of links to my speeches. The bold ones are related to interviews. 6 of these are related to interviews. Speech number 2 was a qualitative analysis of those 40 applications. 31 had interviews. Of those 31 interviews, 27 were, wait for it, new feature, not yet examined. Okay? Continuing, a day in the life of a patent examiner shows you how the examiner performs an interview and how little time he has to do it. Gold mining and more gold mining, speeches 6 and 7, are based on 50 applications from a mid-sized Japanese firm with publications 2014. Since then, since 2014, several things have happened. The allowance rate of the Patent Office has increased substantially from about 70% to about 80%. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, the first action allowance rate of the Patent Office during that period of time between 2014 and now 2021. During that period of time, between this kind of old information and now, the first action allowance rate has increased from 11% to 15%. And here's one, number 17, interview with supervisor. 23, interview with primary examiner. 24, examiner's amendment. And 25, this one is interview rules. The link has not yet been determined. The end of Chocolate with Ed Garcia, speech 25, interview rules. Again, if you follow these interview rules, both by the applicant and by the U.S. attorney, if you follow these interview rules two things will happen. Number one, you will have many less interviews, okay? You will save a lot of money. Number two, the interviews that you do have will be much more productive. They will have a much higher chance of getting a notice of allowance now, okay? That's what you want from an interview. And if the primary examiner is not there, it's impossible, okay? Primary examiner. Notice of allowance now. What do we want? You know, notice of allowance. When do we want it? Now. The end of Chocolate with Ed Garcia. This was speech 25, interview rules. This was the best speech ever. It really was. This was a very effective, very useful speech. The best speech ever. The best speech ever. Woo-hoo-hoo. Yes, it was. Mount Fuji reflects in Lake Kawaguchi, seen from the Misaka Pass in Kai Province. Fujisan. You know, I need to go here and look at this. I need to go to Misaka Pass in Kai Province. I need to make a circle around Mount Fuji and try to find these locations. Wouldn't that be fun? Yeah. I'm not very far. I'm in Nagoya now. Mount Fuji is not too far. Just get on the bullet train and I'm there very quickly. And here we have a small boat with a man. And there he is. He's very small and he's pushing. He has a lot of cargo. Oh, here's another man. I did not even see this person previously. And they are very small compared to Mount Fuji and the reflection of Mount Fuji. Arigatou gozaimasu. Nihon ga daisuki desu. Sayonara, arigatou.